Hey, hold on, I have to unmute.
Oh,
I have it so hi. I have it so everyone joining is going to be automatically muted. So I'm unmuting you guys obviously, but the participants will be muted and then I'm going to ask everyone to turn off their, not you guys, but for participants to turn off their video for the time being, just so that there is a feature where you can minimize all the screens of people that are not showing, and that way it could just be the four of us showing in larger format, so it's not a bunch of black squares.
got it.
But this is my first time doing a live Zoom panel, so if anyone has any suggestions or tips, or if anything goes wrong, we'll work on this together. But I think it's going to be good.
I know I'm learning so many new Zoom tips every day.
Yeah, it's crazy how quickly this just became like the de facto service that we're all using, and it's all happening. So it is recording, and that's great because anyone that isn't able to make it or joins late, we will be able to release the recording at the very end. And yeah, I'm just making sure so the people are on. And if anyone joins and sees this or hears me speaking, just mute your mute your audio and hide your video if it doesn't already happen. It should automatically do it, but I think it's looking good. Hopefully everyone has these 4 rectangles, and thank you guys for coming.
Thanks for putting this together.
Yay. Well, Georgie, thank you for the idea and for some intros and getting this going. So a little bit of background: when Georgie and I met, which was at the very beginning of Sustainable Fashion Circle way back in 2017, you didn't even have your master's degree yet. So you've already completed an entire degree on specifically this topic as well. So I would love to know in your intro just how you decided to study what you did in just the last few years.
Well, I did my undergrad at FIT. I was in the fashion business management program, and I specialized in product development during that time. And when I was at FIT, I did some internships and worked in product development and production roles. And because that production kind of job, you're sort of like the middleman between design and manufacturing, you really get to see the full supply chain and the whole process. And it really just opened my eyes to fashion's blind spots and how wasteful it can be. And I really wanted to dive deeper into the sustainability aspect of things. So really wanted to make a difference. And that's when I undertook my Master of Science degree in Sustainable Environmental Systems at Pratt. And yeah, it was really great because it wasn't necessarily targeted at fashion. It fell under the School of Architecture and focused on urban sustainability. So I got to learn about so many different topics, and it became very broad, and then I could apply it to the fashion industry. So I feel like now I have quite a great, like, robust knowledge of sustainability and supply chain and production. Yeah.
Great. And Mary, how did you get into fashion and sustainability?
Yeah, I feel like I got into this late, and I don't have the formal traditional background. I feel like the stuff that I learn, I'm probably reading from stuff that Georgie and Billy have put out. Like, I'm still trying to kind of catch up. But I started this whole process. I don't have a background in fashion at all, but I was going through my closet and trying to sell a bunch of stuff on Poshmark. I've told this story a few times, but and really just trying to like list everything that it was made out of, hoping that I was selling a closet full of cashmere to make money. And I was found myself writing polyester a lot. I didn't know what it was, and I Googled it, and I was really surprised so naively that it was an entire closet made out of plastic. And that just kind of like sparked my curiosity and made me want to learn more and understand what that meant and why I didn't know this, and sort of why am I spending all this money on stuff made out of plastic that feels very like disposable and doesn't really feel great to want to put on your body once you learn that. And that kind of kicked off wanting to buy better products and really educate what was out there. And I found it hard to find a bunch of alternatives just in what I was looking for specifically. I live in kind of like activewear, especially now. And so really trying to kind of, I felt like if I didn't know, a lot of people didn't know, and there's sort of a platform that needed to be, platform for a lot of this information. And I felt like a brand, to me, felt like the right kind of tool to sort of use as a platform for education while also selling products that kind of fit the mission that you wanted to really promote this message of learning what's in our clothing and the impacts then of, to me, the washing of it and like the detriments of not just wearing the plastic clothing, but what happens when we're caring for it and after is more interesting. I think it's easier to sell people when you're talking about, what's on your skin and kind of the effects personally, but I find kind of the entire life cycle of sort of the issues with using it really interesting.
Yeah, so we're definitely going to get into that a little bit more of the unseen harm that does come with different types of fabrics. And I'm going to ask questions on specific, if anyone has answers on like which specific fabrics that fall into the synthetic plastic category, and if there's ways to rank them, if that even matters. But first, Billy, can you please explain to the group how you fell in? So you have a background in material science, and how did you fall into the fashion category or fibers in particular? What led you to start Kintra?
Yeah. So yeah, my background is in material science, and I spent a lot of time in my academic career studying polymers and composites. I wound up at a company called Carbon in the Bay Area in California doing 3D printing. And the chemistry that we were using there was based off of polyurethanes, which is the same stuff that spandex is made out of. And if you're ever wondering what spandex is made out of and how it's processed, it's some pretty nasty materials. A lot of toxic materials, a lot of materials that just aren't good for the environment and the people using them and creating chemistries with them. So that kind of sparked my interest in like, hey, this is a material that's, finding use in the fashion industry. And I had a lot of different philosophical breakdowns when I was thinking about the fashion industry in general. Spandex is, one of the smallest produced fibers in the synthetic market today. The lion's share goes to polyester. That's where about 50% of the market is being used by. And then it goes down to things like nylon and maybe even semi-synthetics you could count as a synthetic. So treated cellulosics, like tencels, viscose, things like that. But yeah, the further I kept digging, the more interesting it got. And as a scientist, I'm always up for new challenges, and it's nice to create things that are so visceral and so they're used every day. We wear clothing every day. It's an expression of who we are. And for me, just personally as well, it's fun to work on projects that are very personal and almost artistic. So for me, it really came down to, what kind of materials can I create that are going to have the biggest impact, and, designing a material that can solve as many of the problems that I think can be solved just from a pure materials basis. Obviously, there's a lot more than just relying on some magic material out there to solve all of our problems, because that doesn't exist. There's a lot of things like policies and cultural shifts that have to happen in order for everything to work out. But at least from the materials perspective, it's a design problem. The materials that we're used to now, the polyesters, the nylons of the world, were designed when, oil is a cheap, abundant thing. Shale gas is also another thing. These are the plastics that we produce are byproducts of that industry. So that's why they're so cheap and available. The new bio-based economy is interesting because it's starting to shift that source from petroleum to things like farms, where we're producing sugars and cellulosic materials and beyond. If we start looking at things like algae, fungi, things that don't necessarily compete with, or feedstocks that don't necessarily compete with land for food use. So yeah, that's kind of how I got started. It was, the tail end of my last career, and me wanting to, take my creative drive and channel it into something that I felt was not only like stimulating for me to work on, but had I want to solve problems. That's, as a scientist, you want to discover and solve problems. And this just happened to be one of those things that stuck out. And here I am.
Well, what I'm really excited about getting all three of you in particular together is that leading up to this, we talked about how this talk can really be focused on solutions, both currently, like what people that want to be more mindful or help alleviate this problem, what they can do today, tomorrow, in the next few months, years, and then also be forward thinking about what is coming in terms of design. And we'll get into the categories I would love to talk through are sort of like the microfibers and microplastics themselves, and then go into how that, like how they end up in the stream and what the harm is to that, both to humans and the environment, to animals. And then talk about the washing, and because I know I've recently learned a lot more about this just in preparation, but I'm learning that that is where a lot of them are emitted into the stream and sort of shed, and that's something that we all do. And then go into the future thinking. So with that in mind, my first question is for Georgie, and that is around like, what is the difference between microfiber as a word or as a phrase and then microplastic? Because I did read that 91% of microplastic pollution comes from microfibers, and I was wondering if like something else that could be like some of that other 9% is made up of something like the micro beads that are in face wash. Is this like a similar type of thing?
Well, that 91% that I think you're referring to comes from this big global study that they did, where they sort of had these 1 liter grab samples of water and found that the majority of the plastic particles that they found were microfibers. And just to explain the difference between the two, so I think microplastics is kind of an umbrella term for plastic particles that are smaller than 5 millimeters and can be invisible to the naked eye. They can come from a variety of sources, like car tires, city dust, marine coatings, and then plastic products that's breaking down in the environment slowly. But microfibers refer to the tiny little specks that fleck off our clothing when we washing or just in our day-to-day. Microfibers can be referred to natural and synthetic. So kind of it can be used interchangeably when you're talking about plastic microfibers or just microplastics. Yeah.
I'll just add, I think that was a great, is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, what I think when I was learning about this as well, because at first I thought like, oh great, so I'm solving this, by choosing a better material. I'm taking something that takes all of I was originally just looking at microplastic pollution, and then I saw microfiber, and it definitely was confusing. And I think every fabric will, and Georgie, definitely correct me if I'm wrong on this, every fabric will shed some sort of microfiber, but it depends what that fabric is made out of. So cotton, and even we work with Tencel will shed microfibers into the water. But the difference there is what they're made out of. So something like a cotton or a Tencel that's made with natural materials will still biodegrade. So it will shed the microfibers. It will be more likely to biodegrade in the water versus a microplastic will not. But that's where I don't want to get too complicated, but where it's also important to think about the production and like the processing and the dyes and all the chemicals that are used. Something that's made with a natural material, but that's dyed in a conventional way, it's going to shed those microfibers. And then still when it's in the water, kind of decomposing in that way. So
it'll be a toxic microfiber. So there's sort of like toxic microfiber versus non-toxic, more natural microfiber.
Yeah, something
and
like
plastic might always
organic cotton dyed in a natural way.
Yeah.
So just go into the water and hopefully there's no other, it was done in a completely clean, non-toxic way that will just biodegrade in the water. But everything that's applied during production process and fashion that's shed, that will stay on the fibers through the care process.
Yeah, and also microplastic is also very adherent to like free floating pollutants like mercury. So it becomes a lot more toxic in the environment as opposed to a natural microfiber.
Okay, so not about its composition, but what happens once it's exposed.
And the fact that it's very adherent to free floating industrial chemicals.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, a lot of people, our company, what we're doing is producing materials that are compostable. So that's, when people say biodegradable, that's kind of a blanket term that can mean many different things. To be more specific, you can break things down into like a compostable material. And then within that, there's home composting standards. There's thermophilic, which is high temperature. There's also anaerobic, so a lack of oxygen and the microbes that exist in that environment that will break down a material. And then of course there's what we're talking about, like marine degradability, there's freshwater degradability, there's soil degradability. It gets really complicated really quickly. And as someone who's, our business is designing materials to be useful for the fashion industry, reducing greenhouse gas reduction, reducing, environmental harm, how do you design a material? Do you design it for something that you know is going to be ending up in the marine environment, or do you design it for something that has a good shot of going away or being digested in a wastewater treatment facility? Those are tough questions. There's lots of different organizations out there who have opinions on how these materials should perform at the end of their life. I think an ideal situation would be to prevent the release of those microfibers in the first place from even getting to the marine environment. And then also what, you guys are talking about with, you can use a great material like organic cotton, but if it's dyed with toxic chemicals, that degrades, that gets released in the environment. Is it really solving any problems? There's other materials that are starting to become more in vogue that aren't really commercially available yet, but maybe some of you guys have heard of PHAs, polyhydroxyalkanoates, materials in that class, which are touted to be marine degradable. As a scientist and someone who knows maybe a little bit more about these materials than the average person and how these tests are conducted, you really have to ask questions of, what are the experiments that are being done to understand the degradability. So if it degrades in a marine environment, how long does it take? Is it 2 weeks? Is it a month? Is it 2 months? What's good? Like there is no real standardization of like what's good or what's bad. It's great if something breaks down over time, but what if, some marine life consumes it before it has a chance to break down? Like what happens then? So there's a lot of unanswered questions. There's a lot of really smart people studying this stuff currently. And I'd be happy to share any sort of, I know some like research institutions that are really spearheading this stuff. So I can maybe send links after this or something if anyone's interested, but this is like a really like nascent kind of problem that we're really trying to understand here. And again, I'm specifically our business, we're trying to work within that current way of thinking, because we don't want to produce something that at the end of the day isn't useful or isn't solving any problems, which is the most important thing here.
And if it's solving problems that it's well communicated to the consumer how it's solving those problems and how their behavior impacts that and what they do at the end of life, like all that needs to transfer on. Otherwise it almost doesn't matter, like the design is stuck in its own nutshell. And I think that definitely that's where the industry is headed, is about being more transparent and open. I am curious though, like how we got here. So synthetics are over 60% of the average closet, but some people it might be higher, like 90% of their things, unless you're consciously seeking out natural materials or live in a culture where they are just more prevalent. It's likely that you have a high percentage of synthetic materials in your closet. And like part of me thinks I'm gonna say whatever, like I don't know who I'll offend and all this stuff because I'm just learning, but part of me thinks that it's like a lobbying thing by people in the oil industry wanted it to happen because they obviously benefit. The more oil that's used, more plastic, it's cheaper, so you can make more of it and that sells more, and the more fashion, blah blah blah. That's like how we ended up here. But then if I put if I listen to the angel, maybe I'm thinking that, polyester could have solved a problem of, it doesn't wrinkle as much, it lasts longer potentially. I mean, obviously if it doesn't decompose until over 200 years, like it might last longer than something that wears through, like cotton t-shirts are more prone to wearing through. So, do you guys have any thoughts on like how we ended up here? Was it a mix of those things that I just said, or is there something else that I'm missing entirely? Like why are we even talking about this?
I could just kind of say something about like the polyester and synthetics industry and why we even have those textiles in our closets today. mean, a lot of that stuff was developed during, like World War II, like research projects that the government sponsored from these big chemical companies, because we didn't have enough clothing for soldiers and we needed something that was cheap and available and durable, better than cotton. I mean, you can imagine a soldier in a, somewhere in a trench or in like an environment where you don't want clothing that's going to be waterlogged and, rip or break or whatever. You want something that's really durable and cheap to make. So that was timed kind of, right when, the oil and gas industry realized that, hey, we have these byproducts that can find extremely good use in making these materials. Oh, and by the way, we need to start producing this now because the government wants it. And that's kind of how things happened. If you want to think about it as like a giant research project that many governments across the globe were spearheading at the time. And yeah, so that's kind of how things came to be with most synthetics. And then from there, it's, economies of scale. The stuff is really cheap to make at scale. And once you start producing, the prices go way, way down. I mean, polyester is an interesting material because the material itself is a commodity as well as the ingredients that are used to make it, which is kind of an interesting fact. But, and most of the polyester production has happened since, the 1950s. It's not like we've had this stuff for a very long time. It's only been in the last half century or so.
Yeah, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I wrote a piece a while ago because I've been super interested, same thing, on how we got here and kind of understanding that. And I think Billy did a great job of kind of the initial, like how it got, like why polyester was made. And I think you think about all the different, like the reason I didn't know that all my stuff was made out of polyester, because it's a great sort of like camouflage material. It can be in your leggings, I think, is like the kind of common one. You feel it and that kind of like feel of a legging, but it's also in like your sweaters and stuff that you think, I thought it was cashmere. I mean, I knew nothing about fabrics and I thought I had all wool, whatever, the feeling of like wool or cashmere or silk or something. When you feel it, polyester can really kind of blend itself into any one of those. And so it really allows itself to, it's cheap, as he said, and you can use it for so many different things. And especially in activewear, it has all these, you can blend it with a lot of the chemical properties to be sweat wicking and odor resistant and things like that you're applying, that a lot of the natural fibers have on their own, but maybe not, they're not quick dry and things like that aren't really properties. And so because it's has all these I don't know the science, and so I probably am misspeaking on like how a lot of the chemicals are applied, but that is definitely one where it was really attractive to fabric producers. And one thing I read last night, because the stuff I can't get enough of, I look a lot into the recycled polyester thing, because that's sort of in the like eco activewear space. That's there are a bunch of, in sustainability, I feel like there's no right or wrong. Everyone has their like values that you go with. And so sometimes if recycled polyester sort of fits more with the values, there's options there. But I did read that Unify, which is one of the largest producers of polyester, does own Reprieve, which is like a huge, the brand that supplies all of the a lot of the recycled polyester, is a huge producer there. And so oftentimes it is still these big oil companies that are benefiting from, even if it's recycled plastic, they're still benefiting there. And so I think that's something that I didn't really know, and that's something I want to do more research into, but still understanding sort of they do still have a foot in the game and still want to produce and kind of push, oh, it's recycled as still a better option, but they're still kind of have a hold in that as well.
And I was wondering on what you said is perfect to what I was thinking. So, and I think I was jumping ahead too much. So this is great. Like, so when you say recycled polyester, you're talking about simplest message that we see all the time right now is like, this used to be a plastic water bottle. That's like the rPET, right? Which is the plastic that's been recycled. Is it the same when you use recycled natural materials, that you can't use 100% recycled? Do you still have to mix it with some amount of virgin material? Does anyone know? Which might not matter in terms of microplastics, but it matters in terms of it's recycled, but how much of it is recycled?
Yeah, I think it really depends on like the recycling technique that's being used. I know most synthetic materials like polyester, it's hard to find stuff that's like completely 100% recycled. They usually have to mix in some virgin material just because the melting process and like the physical recycling process can degrade the material most often. But for things like cotton and wool, or, you know, whatever other maybe natural material you want to think about recycling, there's different ways of doing so. You could chop up fabric and you can just kind of respin the staple fibers, which are like the short little pieces that make up cotton. There's other, you know, companies out there that are starting to like literally digest the material, and then kind of like in a similar way that tensile or viscose is being processed, you can dissolve the cellulose and you can respin it as a new fiber. And I think that's actually Lensing, the company that makes tensile, has a fiber. I think it's called like Refiber, actually.
Refibra.
Yeah, Refiber. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So they take, it might be like pre or post consumer scraps from textiles, and they can just like put it back in their process, which again, what they're doing, semi-synthetic materials are literally, you take any sort of cellulosic material. So that can be anything from trees or shirts that are made out of cotton. And you can like pulp it again, and you can respin another fiber. Of course, like there is some chemical treatment in order for that to happen. But it's arguably it's a step in the right direction. And, you know, at the time, recycled polyester was also a step in the right direction as well. But I think we can do better because, you know, where is Unify getting all of their recycled water bottles from? It's Indorama, which is the largest PET producer on the planet, are leaning in and making more water bottles every year because they know that there's a market for selling, or like people, you know, looping it back into this other industry. So, and there is no really good method for recycling microfibers to the best of my knowledge. So it's not really a useful solution in my mind. I think it's, again, getting people on the same page is a good thing, but I think for the future, people want to see better options out there.
One more thing, because I just think this is super interesting, is when you mentioned sort of the companies and making the bottles, so you could say, oh, it's made out of recycled bottles, but they're not actually like post-consumer bottles, is that actually, because fashion now has this massive demand for recycled polyester, because it's kind of like the cool, easy, like eco thing to sell, the demand has actually driven up the price. And so that companies like Coca-Cola that rely on being able to bottle with, you know, hopefully that, you know, we could get them to go back to glass bottles, but I don't think that's a reality. They rely on being able to use the recycled plastic bottles. It's actually become much more expensive for them to source because all these fashion brands are taking them. And so it's just a really interesting, I think it was Fast Company that I saw the article, and I can share, but that it's having kind of a chain reaction sort of negative in other industries that actually really need this. Whereas fashion, it's sort of just this like, cool, it is, I don't want to knock it. It's definitely a step in the right direction. But it is kind of having this chain reaction on other industries as well.
Yeah, I want to knock it because I feel like it sends a message that is misleading to the customer, and it still doesn't solve the microplastic problem, and the fibers are of lower quality than if they weren't recycled. And so I will love to see just skipping over this step, and then yes, going back to like keeping it in the stream of plastic becomes plastic. Like that to me just makes the most sense of recycling, just the same way glass gets recycled into glass. And yeah, I would prefer like using a natural material like that, but we'll save that for another chat. But so on like kind of on this topic and bleeding into the next one is on like mixed materials. And so I was trying to understand if, like, for me, when I first started researching the fashion industry, which I think a lot, like we all kind of a couple years ago, I don't know why, we just a couple years ago had this like decision that we wanted to jump into this specifically with a sustainability angle. And now obviously it's grown so much, which is exciting, but is the reason why we need these types of conversations is to sort of clarify all this that's going on. But anyways, I had been researching like chemical recycling and natural materials and things I'd never really thought about. Same to you, Mary, like didn't really know what was on my tags, and was doing all that research for just my own closet and my own design ideas. And I just immediately started thinking that like it needs to be 100%, otherwise it's bad. That was just like an easy way for me to start labeling things. And I'm wondering if that is too harsh, or because when it comes to like recyclability and compostability, like the easiest way is if it's 100% natural fiber, it's easiest to go back into that form. But realistically, we don't have the systems right now to just collect cotton. Like, everyone's just donating everything in bulk anyway. So I'm curious, especially too, on like the shedding, the microplastic shedding front, like, is it necessarily better if it's like mixed with a natural fiber, or like, are there mixes that matter, or is it just like one thing's always bad, one thing's always good? I don't know who wants to take that, Georgie.
I think, well, as far as I know, I think like a cotton poly blend can get separated, but when it comes to like elastane, like there's issues there with separating and recyclability. But I think Mary might know a little bit more about that aspect.
No, you definitely have it.
Yeah.
I don't know a bunch about all the other blends, but I do know, I think you're spot on that. Like, there are some, I know that I'm blanking on the company's names, but I think Billy kind of alluded to them before, that are able now to work in different ways, whether it's kind of melting them and then using the same like lensing tensile process to sort of make them a cellulosic, like sorry, the scientific terms I'm not great with, but like being able to kind of like melt it down and then put it back into a fiber. And I think even with different blends, I don't know, I can't remember. I think some are purely cotton based. I think the blends are tougher, especially when you don't know what blends you're working with. Maybe you jump in if you know more. I don't know as like.
No, I think you guys covered it. I think the biggest issue is when you have something like a spandex in another like woven or knitted blend. There aren't really any chemical recycling processes to separate and get those components again. Normally, when you spin spandex into a fiber, it's like a solution it's using a really toxic, nasty chemical. And it's a wet spinning process. So the material is like a solution, and then you spin it, and the solvent evaporates out. Unless you have that same solvent and like a temperature that's at the right temperature to remelt it or put it back in solution, it's going to be difficult to recycle. I do think that the chemical recycling method is a really interesting, viable option for the future, just because you can, especially for polyesters, the reaction that's used to make a polyester actually produces water. So like the monomers, when you mix them together and they react, it produces water. So the reverse reaction can also happen too, where you add water and it breaks down the polymer into its respective monomers. So there's a few companies that are starting to look at this as like a commercial option. There's one in China called Zeppelin. They're mixing ethylene glycol, which is one of the monomers used to make PET. They're literally soaking like any sort of mixed waste stream with ethylene glycol at high temperature, and it's breaking down the material again, and then they can distill and separate any of the monomers for reuse. So you can get virgin feedstocks or virgin ingredients again. There's other companies like Eastman and Titan Biosciences, which all have like their own kind of methods of doing this with slightly different chemistries. But I think that's going to be really something to look forward to in the near future, just because cotton poly blends doesn't really matter. The process will be able to separate all those things out at the end of the day. So we all know how poor us humans are at recycling things. I think recycling rates are like, just for any plastic, are like 8% or something like that. That's horrible. Like I don't think human behavior is going to change that drastically to make recycling like a really viable option, or at least the physical recycling. But if there is infrastructure in place where you can just funnel all sorts of waste clothing, and it becomes economically viable for these companies, then that's going to be a huge breakthrough for everyone.
I have a question for you, just because I'm curious.
Mm-hmm.
When you send something, say a pair of leggings that has a bunch of thread and maybe other things on it, is that also able to be dissolved in the process, or do those things have to be removed because they're not?
No, that's a good question, because every fiber that you have, whether it's cotton or polyester or nylon, there's going to be other additives and things in it, usually, for anything from a dye to flame retardants to antimicrobials to like whatever you can think of. There's usually some sort of other chemistry involved in that plastic. I think I'm not we're not studying that yet. And I say that yet because that is something that I think is really interesting. And as a company that's making our own, biosynthetic material, we're going to want to really know how this thing breaks down at the end of its life and what kind of materials we can put in it that, give it the value that people are expecting for any of their fabrics that they're purchasing, but also fitting into this like new socially conscious way of thinking about materials. And the short answer is I think a lot of these companies are going to find it difficult to like separate all the junk that's not like the useful stuff. And I think that's that makes it really difficult from an economic standpoint. People, it's going to be tough for brands to put their money where their mouth is for price. I mean, if you want something that's, completely virgin but recycled material, like that's going to cost money. And it all comes down to, top down driven from like consumer brand, and it kind of trickles down. So we'll see what happens, but this industry is usually pretty slow moving, and it's all about P&L for a lot of companies. So we'll see what happens, but I'm optimistic. I think this is the sort of stuff that needs to change.
I like that. I'm optimistic about the recycled water bottle fabrics just in seeing how quickly that took on. So if that comes out that maybe there are better solutions out there, I hope that we can be quicker or as quick to adopt the newer ones as well. So that's a positive spin to put on all this. Thank you. So I would love to think about, okay, for solutions for people that are buying and wearing clothes, which I think is everybody here watching. On the one hand, like the most sustainable is everything that already exists as it exists. So no more processing, whatever, just like keep things alive and in use as long as possible. And so that is like, the fact of the matter is we have a lot of synthetic items already in our closets, and if we want to continue to use them, what do you guys suggest, each of you suggest in terms of caring for them to both make the item last longer and minimize harm on the planet and ecosystems?
I'll start. And I'll also just preface it by saying that although like we can do these little action steps, this whole system of synthetic clothing and microfibers like should not be put on the consumers. Like it should be like system change and how fashion brands produce clothing. And that's where like real like change can be seen. It shouldn't be like our problem to do all these little things, but I will offer some tips that can be helpful. So one of which, if you can, hand wash your synthetic clothes, because that does reduce shedding. You can ensure that you're not washing your clothes on high temperatures, because that increases shedding.
Okay.
You can try not to use like excess detergent and softeners, because that also will release more fibers. And interestingly, washing your clothes on the delicate cycle, because there's more water involved, also increases shedding. So those are just some tips you can take.
Yeah, I was going to say also, just for things like color fastness and like the feel of your fabrics, most plastics don't really like high temperature. They'll start to absorb a lot of water, or they'll start to warp. They'll reach a point in the material where it's like there's a physical transition in the material where it will become slightly softer. So that's why, when you buy things that are made out of polyester, they usually come like heat set. So when you start washing things at temperatures that reach that temperature again, it kind of loses its thermal history and it can start to act wonky. And, I know a lot of people who don't like buying polyester just because after the first wash, it feels different for them. And that's usually the reason, is when you take it up to high temperatures, it can start to warp and shrink and absorb water in ways that are not great for the final garment itself. But yeah, I think what Georgie said is exactly right. I mean, hand washing is like the gentlest way of doing it. But yeah, I mean, there needs to be, it's tough. It's like, these are cultural shifts. You can't just tell the whole country, let's just say the US, for example, to like not use, or like, for example, us in New York City, it's like we go to our laundromat, and depending if you're doing it yourself or it's like a drop off, like they're just going to do whatever process is available to them. And, it's tough. Like, what do you so like now you have to like mandate how those companies do business and how they do their washing, and I don't know, maybe there's a way to make that work, but yeah, it's a really complex issue. And at the end of the day, if you like something, I'd say just buy quality. That's ultimately gonna be really great for like the longevity of your garment. And yeah, take care of it like it's like your baby or something, you know, don't just throw it off and let someone else like really like manhandle it, I guess.
And can I also add, there's also like microfiber capturing products on the market, like the Guppy Friend, which is a garment wash bag that absorbs microfibers during washing, and the Cora ball, which is kind of like this plastic ball with these little spiky bits that sort of capture fibers when you wash your clothes. But once again, it's not necessarily accessible to everyone. The Cora ball, I think, only has about a 25% capture rate. The Guppy Friend, it's unclear, but maybe about an 80% capture rate. So yeah, there are some like complexities there, but there are products on the market.
How do you know if those are working? Because I feel like I've just tried, but you can't see if they're working, right? Or am I missing something?
Well, yeah, because some of the fibers are like invisible, like you can't see them. But over time, like I do have a Cora ball, like you do see like the bigger fibers that do get caught. But then again, I don't know how well it's working, which is why I'm saying it with some, skepticism.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those were going to be my kind of two that make me at least feel like, sort of you have to wash your clothes, especially, if you're going through. The funny part though is I also live in New York and I don't have laundry in my building. So I've sent out my clothing in the past with my, I have both the Guppy Friend and the Cora ball, and I sent them to the laundromat before and they didn't come back because I think they were like, what is this? And so I think just, but I do think those are kind of, I don't know, solutions that if you want to feel like you have some sort of like you're doing something, you're trying, those are great options. We're actually in the process of trying to partner with Guppy Friend and have those as other solutions on the Reprise site as a reseller, just to kind of offer. I know that the tough part with some of these things is just like price point, and that sometimes it's not an accessible thing for everyone. So I'm trying to offer a bunch of different solutions. So hopefully those will be up soon. But that's kind of my favorite in terms of feeling like trying to, do your part.
Yeah, because the other interesting thing, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but like, let's say we could collect all the microfibers that are produced during a wash cycle or even a dry cycle. What do you do with them? Like, how do you dispose of them properly? Is it just going to end up at a landfill anyways? Is there a great way to recycle that? And that kind of goes back to, again, for me, I think chemical recycling seems like a good option if we can do it in an economical way, but we're still a little ways off from seeing that. So
yeah, I love that you brought that up. I know you mentioned it earlier too. Like, it's so cool you have these, but like it'd be really cool to see a solution come from like someone can make something out of it, because you're sort of like, okay, cool, so I caught these at least from entering the water stream, but I don't know, like I just say to throw them away, and so that's not really a great solution.
That is the problem. Like, most people don't know how to dispose of them and they end up going down the drain. But there is this one company called Planet Care, and they are looking into having this take back program. And I don't know how they're going to control all of this. It seems like a lot of logistical issues involved, but the take back program would be sort of collecting the cartridges, extracting the microfibers, and then turning those into insulation panels. And that's sort of their sustainability plan. How realistic it is, I'm not sure, but it is one company who has an idea of what to do with them.
To start.
And so as these companies come up, both so on the recycling front, like the chemical recycling especially, and then also on the laundry machine front, are you seeing anything in terms of policy where governments are getting involved in the US or abroad that, like, is anyone proposing something that seems to help?
Well, in California specifically, there's a lot more like legislation around just investigating the microfiber issue and starting to create some policy around there. There has been some proposed policies about labeling clothing, as well as ensuring that laundromats have filtration installed, but that hasn't been passed yet. It's only been proposed. And also that like all new washing machines have built-in filtration systems. So the conversation's happening, but all very early days.
Yeah, I think I saw, I don't know, maybe last year, now 2 years ago, I think the bill is in California and Vermont to propose that anything sold made of polyester comes with a microplastic warning on it. I thought that was super cool. It didn't get very far, but things like that. The policy side of things is where I think it's super interesting now, watching the bag ban in New York and kind of learning sort of how that process happens and sort of the effects there. I think that's, I don't know, that's the part that I'm now getting really interested in, sort of figuring out where can there be a bigger effect there, because I agree that Georgie, when you said it shouldn't be on the consumers necessarily. It's great to feel like you're doing your part and educate yourself, but I do think sort of policy change and larger acts are going to be what makes a bigger shift. So yeah, I think, and I feel like there was maybe something out of France now, I'm trying to remember what I read, but I feel like there was a policy, I don't know if it was anything that got passed, but about same kind of thing of like labeling.
Yeah, it was like anything with 50% synthetic fiber or more gets, like, says it's advised to hand wash this garment.
So this question actually was asked by the audience, Liza. Thank you for the question. And she says, does it make sense for government to get involved, or does it really fall to the clothing companies to change things? Which we sort of just talked about, but at the same time, it seems negative to say we have to label this as a harmful thing, almost like cigarettes, different obviously, but like cigarettes saying this is harmful to your health. Is there a positive spin, or have you seen any policies or way it's working where it's positive, where you're incentivizing brands to make things out of natural fibers, or to have the recycling or anything that relates to this, that it falls on the brand, but they're getting something beneficial for it, aside from just doing the right thing and, you know, long-term sustainability and consumer, hopefully, appreciation. But yeah, on like the policy or government side, have you seen anything more positive about it?
I personally haven't, but I was going to say, I think the way that this is most likely going to work is you're going to have, you know, all this material that's being produced. Let's say we could capture all the microfibers that we produce, and there's like some sort of like repository where they went before they were, where their final fate was to be decided. It would have to be, you know, there has to be some sort of like process in place where a company could make use of that material. And let's just say, because it's a waste stream, that it's either extremely cheap or maybe even free. That company would probably have to take it back and then make something useful out of it. It sucks to say that, you know, a lot of this stuff is driven by like money and economies, but like that's, at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. I mean, we can't forget here that what we're talking about is clothing, which is a consumer product, and to think that there's going to be some wand that we wave that, you know, gets rid of this stuff in a way that makes sense for everyone is being naive. Like I think we as a human species have to come up with a viable solution that makes economic sense in order for us to like really handle the problem the way that it should be handled. So I think the good news is, like, this stuff is so early on that it's just going to take some time. It's not like this has been a problem for 15 years. I mean, it has been a problem for 15 years because we've been washing clothes and we just didn't know about it. But now that we're aware of it and we're starting to understand it, I think people are going to step up to the plate and start offering solutions. And, you know, Georgie mentioned that company that's, you know, upcycling or the material to insulation. You know, it's companies like that, I mean, that are going to make a difference. The more companies that are out there that are doing things like that, it's going to become more of like a cultural, like, oh yeah, that's what we should be doing. And, you know, maybe inspire some people to take things into their own hands, and I think everyone here has that sort of background, as we were inspired to do something because we thought it was the right thing to do. So I don't know, I feel positive about our generation changing things, because this could define our generation, you know, just what we do with plastic waste. Yeah, I think, again, we have to keep working on it, but having some faith in the people who are out there thinking about these problems and being collaborative too. It's not like one company is going to solve all the problems. And we've already talked about a lot of different industries here that are all kind of commingled into one value chain. So it's going to take a lot of collaboration and cooperation and, you know, government and business and yeah, just like the cultural shift.
I think one thing too that's really interesting to have watched from the, you know, recycled polyester and the plastic bottle thing is the marketing message. And I think, so maybe one side of it comes from government regulation on the fashion brands, but I think the other side really comes from consumer demand. And I think that message, it's amazing whoever really got that super clear, because it caught on and people love it. I don't know how many people who come up to me and say, like, you know, they want to share in their like interest in this with me. So they'll say, you know, I've got these cool leggings, they're made from plastic bottles. And, you know, it's fun that people share that with me because they feel really excited about it. And so I think whatever that is next, when we find sort of what's the next material or what's the next like marketing message, it's really the story you have to tell. I think the way people love it because they feel like, you know, they're doing their part, or they're helping by buying this product. And I know like it feeds into kind of like the consumerism part, and the best part is really just like not necessarily buying new stuff is the answer, but it can help kind of get people thinking about sort of what are they doing and sort of what are they buying. And so I think it really comes down to the message that we want to tell and sort of what is that message and how can we have it spread the same way that this one has been really interesting to see take off. And I think it comes, the more people are excited about it, the more demand there is and the more can it spread. So I think it sort of comes from both sides.
Yeah, can I add one thing to that on the marketing side? I think like it's great that consumers are getting excited about recycled plastic water bottles, and I think microplastic reduction will probably be the next best thing in that regard. But it can become quite greenwashy, as we already spoke about with recycled plastic water bottles. And you know, if some brands are using a fabric that claims to biodegrade within a certain amount of days or months, in lab conditions, it may not be true in the real world. And so they could be selling a false idea and selling an idea to consumers, and then they're getting excited about this thing that's like not really reality. So we also have to be cognizant of what brands choose and how that is marketed to people.
Totally. We'll have the next marketing that takes off that's accurate and not greenwashing.
Yeah, let's come up with it here. So I think that's why we wanted to call this talk Our Plastic Closet, because I don't personally want to be wearing plastic if I can avoid it. And I think people, if they thought twice about like the recycled bottle thing, they might realize that too. Like, I just personally think polyester I just think it could have negative effects on your skin and just other things, which we won't go into too much. But I think first raising awareness that all those different names, it's like sucralose for sugar, right? All the different oses, and how people started to realize that in an ingredients label that anything ending in OSE was actually a sugar and should be treated as such. It's maybe the same for like letting people know a glossary of things that are synthetic materials, and not saying like avoid these at all costs. If people have certain reasons for their workwear, for whatever, like there are reasons for these materials to exist. However, letting people know what they are and how to identify things, and just coming up with like a simple glossary would be great. And then I'm reading a question from Adam, and it's on the same topic of like, if brands could adopt a more natural, less shedding fiber and produce it at a similar mass scale to these synthetics and price point, do you guys see that as a possibility? We've sort of talked about this, but we haven't like fully addressed it. So is there a possibility to get to that or even surpass the scale that we see for synthetics right now? And I'm talking like, even if you want to say you think it'll happen, but it's 10 years from now or whatever, like I would love to know what you guys think about if this is possible for the future. And last part of his question, are there current options that look promising to fill the gap that maybe are happening like at independent brands? And Mary, would love to hear like the fibers you're using for your clothing, and Kintra, you specifically as well are developing fibers. So you guys are perfect for this question, but yeah, how do you see that reaching scale? Are there certain options that seem better than others or more realistic than others on the performance front and on the like recycling, everything? Can brands band together and place an order? I don't know if that type of collaboration is ever going to be possible, but in order to bring down the costs. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I can start because this is kind of what our business is. It's, you know, we create a material that is hopefully going to be a replacement for some of the materials that we've talked about in the synthetic space. But in order to replace any of those materials, there's three like key criteria that have to be met. And the first and foremost is it has to perform as good or better, or better yet, it has to have some sort of unique feel or property that isn't on the market already. That's why spandex is so valuable. That's why Tencel is so valuable, is because there aren't any other options like that on the market that are really competitive with it. So the performance is a really huge issue. There's a lot of materials that are coming out that, you know, have like the eco sensibility to them, but they just don't perform, and people aren't going to replace a product that, you know, still doesn't have the environmental performance, but just doesn't perform physically. It's kind of a non-starter. Same thing goes for price. You know, in development and any sort of new materials development, it's going to be expensive at the lab scale, but once you start getting to quantities that are commercial, so like in our case, like once we start buying 20 metric ton quantities of our raw ingredients, that's when we start seeing price reductions from, you know, let's say $15 a kilo to $2 a kilo for the raw materials.
Can you just say about how many yards of fabric that would make?
So 20 metric tons of material of like, just say like polyester, it really depends on like fabric weight. And the funny thing about the fashion industry is they talk in yardage, but that says nothing about the width of the bolts of thread that you're buying. There's different widths that you can buy. I think a useful conversion that I had when we were looking at scaling some of our material up was that about 15 kilos of our resin could make, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of about 50 yards of fabric if it was like 60 inches wide, and like a reasonable weight, like maybe 200 grams per square meter. Again, there's like a lot of different factors that go into the yardage of fabric. But yeah, I think, so like, again, back to the original topic was like the performance, the price, and then also like the availability of the feedstocks that you're sourcing from, which kind of is a nuanced way of saying price. Because let's say I come up with a material that exceeds people's expectations in price and performance and environmental performance. Let's say that the material can only be produced, you know, a few tons annually. You know, that's it. Like there's no other way to make that material. That's not a viable option for displacing something like polyester, which is literally in China, they're producing billions of yards of, you know, synthetic fabric every month. That's not even a year. So if you want to have something that's going to stand up to the stuff that's already in place, it has to be from a feedstock or a source that can compete with it. So that's why it's really interesting that, you know, now we're talking about biosynthetic materials where the sources are coming from things like farms, which all over the globe, farms are, you know, powerhouses, and like they're outputting lots of material. And even just taking a fraction of that material and diverting it towards something like making a new biosynthetic material is a viable option. That's why we have things like PLA, which are, you know,
Corn.
Corn-based.
Can I ask a question about that? So do the farms get paid for those materials, or do they have to pay to recycle them the same way it would be for, say, fabric waste? Like brands have to pay to get rid of it instead of being paid for something that's going to be used for someone else. I'm just curious how that works.
I think so. For PLA is an interesting case. The largest producer of that is NGO NatureWorks, which is like a subsidiary of, I believe, DuPont or Dow, which I think DuPont and Dow are the same company now. But they take all the corn that's produced in the US, they take about 0.2% of that, and they funnel it into a factory which extracts lactic acid and then does all the polymerization to make PLA. And that's all on site in Nebraska. They have like a factory there. So they have some sort of joint partnership with the farms that are producing this stuff. And it starts to get really weird because, like, you know, corn and soy and wheat are all subsidized by the US government, and that's already produced at really large scale. We can start talking about things like, you know, farming practices. Like a lot of the monoculture crop that's being produced in the US and abroad aren't using sustainable farming practices. So that's actually, you know, depleting our soils. It's releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and it's actually counterproductive to the goal that we're trying to achieve here, which is, again, reducing plastic waste and also reducing carbon emissions. So it gets kind of complicated pretty quickly, and this is exactly the sort of stuff that we're dealing with. And as we set out producing new materials and trying to get to that scale point that makes us competitive, who are our feedstocks, or where are our feedstocks being produced? What are the farming practices used to produce them? What's the performance? What's the price? And ultimately, like, how much good are we really doing? And that usually you can figure that out with a life cycle analysis, which looks at all of these things, everything from carbon to water to social and end of life, which we've already talked about.
Right, and we won't get into this now, but like also how is it keeping up with sources as they change, as farms inevitably will change what they produce, as you know, nutrition changes, as we know more about that, and how are the industries just working better together, so that, because if one feeds into the next, they have to be always keeping in touch for the future to make it work. So I'm combining like this question that we already started talking about with Gabby's as well, just for sake of time. Thank you, Gabby. Would love to hear from each speaker on what they think the future of textiles fibers will be in the long term. Will we stop making plastic-based at all? Will they be all bio-based? And what makes you guys most excited about the future? It's not for me. I'm going to take this question first by saying, like, when we were kids, we probably thought the future was plastic clothing, but it didn't look the way that it looks now, right? Like, I'm picturing Xenon and wearing like hard plastic clothes that didn't go through a washing machine. They were hand washed because they stood up. Like, maybe it's plastic, but maybe if that's the future and it lasts forever, like maybe that type of design could come into play. But what do you guys think? Are there things that you are particularly excited about? It doesn't even matter how realistic you think it is, like, just let's hear what's getting you excited.
I'm getting excited about the potential for like lab-grown fibers, like the spider-free silk, you know, things that like Bolt Threads are doing, and like Modern Meadow, and just sort of growing things in labs and combining all these amazing properties and using very little resources to create them. And I'm also excited about circularity of fabrics. Yeah.
Allison, I love that picture of the future so much. Now I'm thinking, like, maybe I have it wrong. Maybe plastic is right, and we just don't wash it. I think the brand, like, when I was trying to figure out sort of what is the solution for, like, what is my take on it, I really felt like I wanted to go more on the natural fiber side. I think Adam's question on sort of like, is that scalable? Obviously, I don't think, you know, Tencel is more expensive, and it comes from a natural material that has to be, you know, trees that are grown, and then, you know, it is a renewable resource, but it still takes a lot of time and energy. I've seen a bunch of really cool options come out of other natural materials. Someone just emailed me about cactus leather. I think there's a lot of really cool, I don't think these are necessarily like scalable, definitely not yet. I think there's I have a ton of hope for the future, as sort of all these really cool the technology comes to be able to separate fibers, to be able to turn them back into something, to recycle them. There's a lot of cool stuff that's happening now. I don't think it's ready yet to be a huge thing that brands adopt, but I do see, like, you know, Patagonia and Eileen Fisher and H&M have huge grants that they award every year for this research. But my interest is really in sort of what other natural resources can we use, whether it's like waste from fruit or other byproducts of the food industry and other things that we can use that are still kind of in that natural realm. So when they biodegrade and break down, you still kind of have that there.
Yeah. I think this is a great question, because it's kind of, for us, it's like what we're trying to shape at Kintra. It's, you know, we're trying to shift the synthetic materials that we know today towards alternatives that are, again, perform just as well, or have other like unique performance properties, but have a natural footprint that's more similar to like the natural ones that we know and love, like cotton, for example. By the way, you know, cotton isn't, there's ways of doing cotton good and bad, right? There's organic cotton, there's, you know, organic certified cotton, and then there's cotton that's grown with pesticides and in places where, you know, water is maybe competing with the needs of, you know, people who are living there. So it's a really complex issue, I think, in terms of, you know, we started this whole conversation talking about microplastics and the physical pollution that that comes from that. You know, I'm excited for any sort of material out there that is designed with that in mind. So again, fitting into the more natural cycle of, you know, how things are done, which again, that's a big focus of why I started this company, is to create materials that don't contribute to microfiber pollution. And I think also there's, you know, again, as a scientist, when I hear the word plastics, I think in like the social, like what everyone's, when they think of a plastic, they think of these hard, intractable synthetic materials. If we're really being technical about it, you know, like our hair and our skin are made out of plastics or like polymers, which are the same thing. You know, it's just one is like maybe collagen or chitin, which is what our fingernails are made out of. And the stuff that we've made as humans that are human designed are, again, they only melt at really high temperatures. They don't break down physically in any real sort of way. I think there's a lot that we can learn from nature and designing materials to have the same performance as the ones that we're used to, but also kind of flowing with the cycles that nature has in place is the way to do it. I think there's a reason that we use synthetics. They're really easy to make when they have the infrastructure is already there to make them. And, you know, the way that we can use synthetics is so varied. We can make them feel really durable and tough, or we can make them feel like cashmere, and it's all dependent on the type of fibers that you're making and the types of yarns that you're making and the processing steps that we use to make them. So that's why they're valuable. But there's like a responsible way of doing things. And I think it's just going to take companies with a new set of ethics and, again, being collaborative and realizing that it's not all about just like selling products and just wiping your hands with it and being clear, like free and clear of it. It's understanding where your product goes, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and how you can design things responsibly from my perspective of materials in a material sense, but also, you know, just whatever infrastructure is out there, how to work with it and, you know, affect change that way. So.
Yeah, to George's point about circularity and how it might fall to the brands in the future that they are responsible for the end of life of their product. So they need to be thinking about that from the design or from a take back and remake program. And yeah, my world is around recycling and reuse and remaking. And I'm often wondering, this is my last question. And then if anyone has any last questions, put it in the chat bar. We have a few more minutes and we'll answer another question or two if they come in. And my question is like, on recycling systems. And so I've heard that for things with specifically spandex in them, that they can't be recycled at plants because they melt and clog up whatever like processes are going on to recycle the rest of the fabric parts. And so I know this from talking to Fab Scrap for one of our meetups, for example. They said if it's a non-proprietary spandex or that type of material, elastane fabric, they will sell it as part of their Fab Scrap store. But if it's proprietary, which means it has to be shredded, and so like anything that doesn't have that would go to insulation, sort of downcycled in various industrial ways. But anything that has this sort of spandex elastane has to be landfilled. And then I'm thinking, well, on the consumer front, we're obviously like the general rule is don't trash your clothing, but if it has those types of materials in it, is it better to just skip the steps of like having it go through all these systems, be sorted or not, and just like throw it in the trash if that's the end result of landfill? And maybe if we tell people to do that, it'll make them realize like, holy crap, this is not like, where is it going when I send it away? Like it's going to the trash, at least that fabric. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Am I right? I just thought of that in our research. You don't have to go on the record saying if that is like something you recommend doing, but in my like thought process, it just makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I feel like you answered your own question. I think I totally agree. Like, why should we make it go to Fab Scrap if it's going to go to a landfill anyway? So, yeah.
But are there certain like percentages or material types that would fall into that category? Because I know it's not all of them, like all blended, obviously.
Oh, so you mean if it's not spandex, if it's like an...
Is it just spandex? Like, am I looking for something that says spandex on the tag? Is that always written on the tag, or does spandex have other names for it? I'm just, again, that's like a very elastane. Okay.
Elastane, lycra.
Yeah, those are There's just different trade names depending on what region, if you're in Europe or North America or somewhere else. But yeah, spandex, lycra, elastane, those are all the same thing.
Same thing. Okay.
Yeah.
My understanding, and I may be wrong on this, and something that I've been really wanting to do more research into, is that if the fabric content is under 5%, it can still be, like if it's a natural fabric, and it can be like a organic cotton t-shirt or something that you could compost, that under 5% is like a negligible amount. But I don't know I don't know, like I haven't fact checked that. I heard it one time in one of the FIT classes. This is something that like kind of keeps me up at night, because we do use, like, there's spandex and leggings, and I tried to find something I was like dead set on making sure that it was at least under 10% when I did my fabric sourcing. Right now we have 7. I'm always looking for ways to, we just released these scrunchies the elastic is made with natural rubber, and so there are alternatives out there. I don't know if I know any fashion companies where like they've used natural rubber. Like I've seen it in shoes, obviously this scrunchie is. I don't know that I've seen it in a fabric. Billy, you may know better, but that's something that like I would love to. It's really, for me as a small brand, like expensive to go through that, find something and make a whole bunch of fabric from it and kind of customize it. But hopefully that's kind of like in 5 years to really replace it with something I would love to. But it's tough from a brand perspective to find like the perfect material, and I'm definitely curious to test out the Kintra fiber. Like I would love to see what you guys have, because I'm always looking for new things. Yeah, I'm curious. But I think that's something that I searched for so long, and eventually you kind of have to, I don't know, a bit of a compromise of like, okay, this is the best that I can find for right now, but I still want to educate, and I still think there's better things I could do better, and there's still ways to improve. And I feel like I'm trying to be super transparent about that. Definitely figuring out new ways to communicate that. It's sort of like, okay, here's where we're at now. But yes, I've tried not to say plastic free leggings as much as I want to, because technically there is some spandex in there, and I don't feel like that's being fully truthful. So trying to say like plant based, but I've still had people who say like, how do you say plant based when there's a bit of spandex in it? And I'm like, well, it's less than 10%. So I figured that was like okay. But yeah, I think that's one thing that I definitely have I'm glad you brought it up, because I'm super like conscious of, and honestly a little self-conscious sometimes when I talk through these things, because you're like, well, yeah, there still is spandex in it, because I for right now haven't found something that for clothing that needs stretch in it, like scalable, viable solution.
No, you're in one of the toughest industries for, like, your category of clothing is definitely the hardest to solve this problem for. So you're just going for it. And I think you already said it, is if you're taking the customer on the journey with you and explaining, here's where we're at, here's where we want to go, and then you're collaborating on this journey together, that you're doing the best you can with what's available right now. So that's all we can ask. And climate positive fibers. This is going to be, I think, our last question, just timing wise, but do you guys have thoughts on regenerative and climate positive fibers? When you say bio-based materials, would that fall under this category? I'm not sure, so educate me.
I think there's a lot of potential with regenerative wool, because wool has superior qualities that usually a synthetic fiber would provide, like wrinkle resistance, odor resistance, sweat wicking, and things like that. So farming in a regenerative way is also combating climate change. And although I think there might be issues with like scaling up wool, and I don't think it can compete with polyester in any way, because of its technical abilities and the fact that you're using land in a whole new way to just be more responsible, capture methane and things like that, there is definitely potential there.
Yeah, I think for the same reason that, things like regenerative wool, that's exactly the same kind of mindset that we have with our fibers, just because, again, the feedstocks that we're sourcing from are coming from farms. So it's the same place that, again, that's the future, is going to our farms and making sure that whatever's happening there is actually carbon negative, or it could be carbon. We could be drawing carbon out of the atmosphere if we practice regenerative farming techniques, and then all the things that the farm would produce would go to something useful, whether it's food or in our case, fibers for clothing. our mission at Kintra is like showing people that, you know, synthetics can come from the same place that you would normally find a natural fiber, and actually be climate positive in the, you know, as it's being done. And it's really tough to get to that point though, because, you know, it's a complex issue of getting buy-in from farmers to switch their techniques if they're not already doing so. That transition can take, you know, many years and can be expensive for them. And it really has to be driven from like a top-down perspective. You know, consumers are going to have to demand it. Brands are going to have to follow suit. And again, that's why I keep kind of expounding on this like collaborative effort. It's everyone's going to have to work together to make this happen. It's not just, you know, me flipping a switch somewhere and saying, hey, we're fully bio-based and we're climate positive. It's like, well, no, there's going to be lots of people doing many things that make that happen. So that's my 2 cents.
I didn't like that. Like, yeah, my last thought on all this is like, one thing that isn't really explored yet is how this can be solved on a super local level. Like I'm talking one person decides that they want their side job or full-time thing to be like, I'm gonna make thread out of old, like I'm gonna do the pulping, and then I'm gonna do, like, as these processes become more widely available, will they happen on an even smaller scale basis, the same way, Billy, that with 3D printing, often people talked about, like, maybe it won't be in the home, but there'll be local service centers. And some people will have access to 3D printer and they'll sort of rent out the time, or they'll handle like the technical processes. That's kind of what's happening with it now. But yeah, in the future, could it be that, like, for example, just a local community gathers their food waste, sorts it, and then gives it to the people that are like the local textile people, and then they turn it into textiles, and there's the local fashion designers, and then they turn it into clothes. And like, could it be that hyper local of a solution that would bring costs down because there's less players involved? I don't know. That's something I love to think about. So thank you guys very much. If anyone has any final words, please say them. Or where can we find you? Actually, I would love if everyone could just go down the line, starting with Mary and then Georgie and then Billy, and just say, where can we find you? Is there anything in particular you want people to do or remember in leaving this talk?
Oh, go ahead.
No, Mary, you're first.
Oh,
You're first.
I live a lot on my brand's page, just really just me. So either Instagram or the website just is at repriseactivore or repriseactivore.com. And I think, I mean, I love that everyone came to join and listen to this. Thank you so much for organizing this. It's something that I love talking about. It's the only time I can kind of like get excited and talk about this with other people. So this was really fun to get the chance to, and I think everyone here has already a good sense of it by joining and wanting to listen about this, but just really kind of taking more of a sort of what's in my clothing. And I think when you said too, the sort of what do I do with it afterwards, I think that's something that I'm still trying to figure out too with Reprise clothing, is sort of what's the aftercare, and sort of every time you buy something, kind of thinking about that full life cycle, sort of where it came from and what's next with it. I love that you brought that up.
I can be found on LinkedIn if you just search me, Georgina Annenberg. And if you're interested in reading my full report on microfibers from synthetic clothing, you can go to ourplasticclothing.com and just download the report from there. And yes, thanks, Alison, for organizing. This has been so great to do with friends, and so lovely to meet you, Mary. And this has been awesome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, and you guys can find me kintrafibers.com. Also, you know, LinkedIn or any other venue, you could reach out. Also, email works as well, if there's any conversations that you want to keep going. But yeah, I think the future looks really bright, I think, and it's exciting that finding out how many other people also care about the same things is really cool. And I think this is the start of something positive, and keep asking questions. That's a really big thing through all of this, is the more questions you ask, the more you'll understand and have, you know, a better informed opinion about what's really going on. And be wary of people who try to groupthink is also an issue too. I think, you know, have your own thoughts and form your own opinions based on the information that you discover, because there's no black and white for any of this. There is a lot of gray area, but also be reasonable with people. I think at the end of the day, we all want to do the right thing, and any little thing counts. Don't let progress get in the way of perfection, or don't let perfection get in the way of progress, excuse me. That's another big one. Don't, you know, putting other people down because it's not up to your standards is not productive. So those are the things I think are useful moving forward. And yeah, thanks to everyone who's on the panel, Georgie, Mary. Yeah, it was great. And Allison, thanks for organizing. This was super fun.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you, and thank you to everyone watching. This is such an early stage for this conversation. So you're literally talking to some of the experts in this space. So and you're some of the earliest to latch on to this sort of problem, and also the solutions, those watching. So thank you all for being interested and asking those questions and not settling. And I know that I'm going to continue to watch this space with all three of you, because I feel like you're going to solve it all together. So thank you for your work and for keeping me positive. Thank you for sharing with everyone. Thank you all for being here in the middle of the week and a really strange time of our world. This has definitely taken my mind off everything for this past hour. So thank you all. And I'm going to follow up with all these resources that we started mentioning, that we've mentioned throughout this talk, and then also this recording, and we'll just continue the conversation. But thank you for kicking it off. I feel like we're all so much smarter in just a short hour. So thank you for taking years of work to get us here.
Thank you.
And I'll talk to you guys soon. I hope to see you soon in New York.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good night.